Hey. Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Chicago, Illinois, the College of Complexes, the playground for people who think. Tonight's speaker,
Walt Zlotow. Walt Zlotow.
Is Walt
Not an easy
Zlotow,
one.
and he will be talking about waging peace in an era of perpetual war. He's from the West Suburban Faith-Based Peace Coalition, so we look forward to his talk. The format is as follows. The speaker will speak, and we will have a Q&A session. And then we will have our infamous rebuttal session. And then at the end, to wrap up, the speaker will give a brief summary and final word. The College of Complexes has two rules, one fool at a time and no personal attacks.
Don't forget
So with
about
that, if anybody has announcements, take it away with the announcements.
Okay, Charlie, go ahead with the announcements. I'll get the screen up in a second here.
All right, welcome everyone to meeting number 3,804 of the College of Complexes, the playground for people who think. We maintain several email lists. You can subscribe to these on the main website or contact me and I'll add you to our internal mailing list. Now, although I am not a capitalist, I will give an advertisement for our upcoming programs. Next Saturday on February the 15th, college regular and librarian Daniel Weinsberg will be talking about what is doing things that are natural as it pertains to food, and he's going to talk a bit about farming. So doing what is natural for your health and welfare. Following that on February the 22nd, we'll be looking at this is our President's Day program. Political analyst Eric Mao will try to define what is the national character of the United States. Always an interesting program. March 1 and 8 are presently open. If you would like to speak, please send me a title and a brief description, and we'll take a look at it. Following that is on March 15th. This is George. We'll be talking about this, our International Women's Day speaker. Yes, Reverend Laura George. We'll be talking about how she is trying to get founding a mother's movement for peace on March 15th. Following that on March 22nd, we're going to have an open mic. We already have 3 keynote speakers, but the topic will be what can you do today to make the world a better place? Everyone will be given an opportunity to tell us what they think should be done. On March the 29th, Eric Mao will be talking about the wealth of the world. That should be an interesting topic, but where we are in terms of wealth distribution in the United States and the world. Okay, that's it. Any community announcements? Take it away, Tim. Or
all right,
John.
Okay, do we have any other announcements from the floor? All right, Andy, you got a couple announcements. We'll then go on from there. All right, Andy, you're on.
I have an announcement on 3 quick sources of information of things that matter to people right now. There's an article 2 days ago on the Smirking Chimp by Tom Hartman. It's called "The Billionaire Coup is Almost Complete and No One Stopped. Can we return to democracy?" And this was written by Tom Hartman. I've got copies for everybody in the audience tonight, but it was on the Smirking Chimp website. on February 6th, an article by Tom Hart. He's been on a roll the last week describing what's happening in our country. Here's a brand new book. I got two books to show you quickly. This one is brand new. It came out a couple months ago. It's called The Medical Pharmaceutical Killing Machine. And it describes how drug companies put out medicines in America that they know are going to kill a certain segment of the population, but they're making profits off of it. And on page 125 of this book, it contains the 26 steps that were used in the COVID treatment hospitals. It's called the FDA
Okay, that'll do, Andy.
It's called the FDA death protocol, and people need to know this to save their loved ones that might get diagnosed with COVID when they don't have it. The book describes in detail how maybe 97% of all people that got a COVID diagnosis were not
Okay.
Are
COVID.
you a doctor?
They might have had the flu. This is it's called
Okay.
The Medical Pharmaceutical Killing Machine. Facing Facts Could Save Your Life. The other book is still available from Project Censored. This is a censored 2011 book that has multiple chapters in it of the false flag of 9/11, where 3,000 people roughly were killed in New York by the Bush-Cheney administration with demolition experts. All 7 buildings were destroyed. And we're still living with the myth that America was attacked by Al-Qaeda on 9/11. We puncture that myth and we can save a lot of money
Okay.
on our military all over the world. So if anybody wants any information on any of these things, come see me after the program.
Okay.
you.
Let's,
No, thanks.
all right. Any other announcements for the good of the community here right now or not? All right, if not, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Walt Zlotow, who's from Illinois, but is in Florida today, and just down there for a while. So we'll welcome Mr. Zlotow. When you're ready, sir, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Now, do I click the share button to have the PowerPoint come up on my screen?
You click the share screen button on your Zoom, and what'll happen is that it'll show up on my screen and everything else. So go ahead and click your PowerPoint button and we'll be all set.
There we go. Okay, let me just see if it's,
It's there. We can see it.
all right, okay, now I'll go back to the beginning. All right. Thank you guys for inviting me to speak at this kind introduction. When you messaged me to speak at the college complexes, I had no idea it was still in existence. I remembered the college in the 1960s, but heard nothing about it since then. So it's glad to know it's still around, and especially that you asked me to talk on a very important subject, the subject of peace.
You could go to full screen on that PowerPoint, by going to slideshow and then doing full screen.
All right.
At the top,
Top.
right at the top. See what's a slideshow?
When I click OK, the meeting is, no, it's being,
No. You're all right. Slideshow. Up towards the top, very top.
I got my computer person here. Hang on 1 second.
Slideshow.
Slideshow.
Right at the top.
The very top line, you'll see home and then go over. Home, insert, design, transitions, animation, slideshow.
You got to get rid of that bar. Can you drag that down? Can
Yeah.
you get rid of this? Or just say, okay.
Okay. Ah, there we go. Slideshow.
slideshow.
Got
There
it.
you go.
Okay, then hit from beginning.
Is that it? We got it.
Okay, yeah, we can do it now. Yeah, you're good. Okay.
Okay. I have been interested in U.S. foreign affairs, especially our military entanglements, for most of my life. I became interested around 1951 when my parents, who were up on world affairs, educated me about World War II and the current war in Korea. I was especially motivated by a show in 1951-52 called Victory at Sea, with great music by Richard Rodgers, which chronicled the adventures of the U.S. Navy during World War II. It was a fascinating program that really spurred my interest in learning about war. Throughout the 1950s, I bought into the concept of US exceptionalism and the McCarthy era fear of attack from communist Soviet Union determined to destroy America from within and without, subversion from within and nuclear weapons from without. That all changed with the Cuban Revolution of 1959, was something that I supported due to the long 25-year brutal dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, where the US tried to overturn the revolution to continue Cuba as a piggy bank for US business, both legal United Fruit and others, and illegal organized crime. That culminated in the failed 61 Bay of Pigs invasion and the 62 missile crisis, which kept this 17-year-old in fear of nuclear annihilation for 13 days. My notion that America was always righteous in foreign affairs had ended. Starting college in '63, I became active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, but dropped out shortly after the war wound down in the early '70s. Then no involvement till August of 2002, when I became aware that the US was going to invade Iraq in a totally made up, unnecessary war, which reignited my anti-war involvement, which continues to this day. About 10 years ago, I began studying post-World War II history to more closely understand how we got to this era many describe as perpetual war, foreign war, forever war, endless war. The result, waging peace in an era of perpetual war, is my attempt to make sense of the last 80 years of US foreign policy that begs every person seeking peace to become informed and involved. Okay, so in our presentation today, we have three objectives. What do we mean by perpetual war? Determine how we got to perpetual war after World War II. And finally, how should we act to achieve a peaceful world for ourselves and future generations? Perpetual war, also known as the War on Terror, is a lasting state of war with no clearly defined enemy, no measure of battlefield success, and no clearly defined end. It's truly a forever war. Characteristics include no consequences for illegal, immoral operations that result in massive civilian deaths using cluster bombs and white phosphorus in contravention of international law. Ted Koppel, the Nightline correspondent, put it succinctly: perpetual war is our children's war. Other characteristics: that it's typically not directed against a nation state, but more so directed at amorphous groups, their tactics, and their leaders. Military operations are commenced and expanded without debate. Furthermore, it requires a permanent war economy, which is the foundation for perpetual war. And we'll get more into that when we get back to the origins after World War II. After the debacle of Afghanistan and Iraq, where we used massive ground troops and lost 9,000 soldiers and contractors dead and hundreds of thousands wounded in body and mind, we now are reliant more on bombs dropped by planes and drones, the use of some personnel, special ops that we don't hear about, don't know about, that are involved in areas around the world. Massive crippling economic sanctions, which is really a form of perpetual warfare against countries. And for example, in Cuba, we've been conducting crippling economic sanctions for 65 years now, to no avail. And recently, we've gotten more involved with the use of proxies, particularly in Ukraine, where our Ukraine proxies have suffered upwards of 500,000 deaths, maybe 500,000 injuries, but not a single American casualty. Perpetual war constantly creates new enemies, starting with the Soviet Union and communism after World War II. We morphed into the secular Saddam Hussein. Then we went to Islamic jihadists. Now we're dealing with Russia again, and we're dealing with Hamas and anybody in the Middle East that's working for a Palestinian state against Israel. Perpetual war involves no sacrifice by the American citizenry. The Bush administration was blatant about this at the beginning of the Iraq War when they said, you go out and shop and enjoy life. Don't worry about tax increases. There'll be none. We'll take care of the war. Finally, the military is glorified by our national culture. we may very likely see tomorrow a military flyover over the stadium where the Super Bowl is held. There may be a gigantic American flag covering the field. Glory to the military. So this is all part of the government's campaign to promote and to maintain perpetual war through glorification of the military. Where are we involved in perpetual war today? Well, it takes a number of forms. It certainly involves bombing, which is killing innocents in several countries. Massive economic sanctions designed to topple regimes, which essentially just make the people suffer and embolden the regime to stay in power to resist the efforts of the US sanctions. And a lot today involves belligerency in our diplomacy that threatens war, that brings us up to the point that we could get into a war with countries that we have a beef with. So if we look at this list, we're bombing some countries. We're bombing people in Iraq, in Somalia. Sixth day of his term, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, tasted blood. He bragged about his first bombing campaign against some people in caves in Somalia, who he claimed were getting ready to attack the homeland. We're bombing in Niger, Yemen, and we're also providing bombs for other countries to attack our enemies, such as Israel, bombing in Yemen, Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. And most dangerously, for the prospect of nuclear war, we're giving ordnance to our Ukrainian proxies to attack inside Russia. And every day since that war started on February 24th, 2022, we have put the entire world at the risk of nuclear war. If there's a mistake, a miscalculation, a rogue military person, and that continues to this day. Then, of course, we have massive sanctions against countries like Iran, China, North Korea, Venezuela, the ones in Venezuela that have been going on since about 2002. Some argue have claimed the lives of several hundred, up to 400,000 Venezuelans from lack of food and medicine. Cuba is astonishing. We've been sanctioning them since 1960. That's 65 years to no avail. Every year the UN condemns the embargo. Only two countries vote against the embargo, and that's the United States and Israel. And recently we are intimidating Panama and Denmark. Panama to get back the Panama Canal, which we bought after we cut off Panama from Colombia at the beginning of the 20th century. And Denmark, because we have this idea under the Trump administration that we have to take Greenland for its resources and its potential to protect the homeland. Now, these aren't all the countries that were involved in some form of perpetual war, whether it's bombs, sanctions, or belligerent diplomacy, but it gives you a picture that we're in the Middle East, we're in Europe, we're in Latin America, we're in the Far East, and this is a good reason why a lot of countries around the world, including these countries, are gravitating toward non-aligned organizations such as BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which are not anti-American, but are non-allied. And they spell, going forward, possibly the death knell of the US trying to dominate the entire world as the sole hegemon. So we get to our second object. So that's an overview, a brief overview of what perpetual war is. And now we get to the second objective, which is the 3 watershed years on the road to perpetual war. 1945, and there you see the peace treaty with Japan. 1991, and we see the fall of the Berlin Wall. 2001, and we see the 9/11 attacks. So our first watershed year is 1945. We'll talk about 2 major events, the death of FDR in April and the end of World War II in August. The death of FDR was a catastrophe for avoiding perpetual war after World War II. FDR, had he lived and remained in good enough health to run, which was unlikely, unfortunately, had during the war a good working relationship, rapport with Stalin, where they established informal spheres of influence. Stalin was interested in having a zone of buffer nations around Russia, around the Soviet Union, to avoid a third attack from the West in the century. the United States was concerned with keeping Western Europe within the US orbit. And had Roosevelt lived and continued to serve, that may have been achieved because Roosevelt had no intention of starting a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Now, there was another possibility for avoiding a Cold War besides FDR living, and that was if Truman had not been the vice president. FDR's death elevated him to the presidency, totally, woefully inexperienced in foreign affairs. Unfortunately, FDR kept Truman out of the loop because he didn't expect to die or not have to serve. They had, I believe, 2 brief meetings that really didn't get into foreign affairs at all. Now, if Truman got into the vice presidency the year before because the Democratic establishment did not want Henry Wallace to remain as president. Henry Wallace had no intention of engaging in belligerent anti-Soviet policy that resulted in the Cold War. And this scared the daylights out of the neocons at the time, particularly in the Democratic Party, who wanted a compliant, they wanted a president, whether it was Roosevelt or Truman, that would do their bidding to ramp up aggression against the Soviet Union. So when Truman gets in, he unfortunately had to rely on his main advisors, who were hardline anti-Soviet officials. Jimmy Burns and Dean Acheson both were advisors and served as Secretary of State. James Forrestal was Secretary of the Navy and later the first Secretary of Defense. We can also include in this group the Dulles brothers, John Foster and Allen, and there were a number of other lesser figures in this group that were determined to create a permanent war economy. So the end of the war amongst this group sparked a fear of another depression if we drew down our military spending. James Byrne was reported to have told Truman, to prevent depression, we need a permanent war economy, and he got it. He also warned, in order to have a permanent war economy, we needed a permanent enemy. So he warned of a worldwide Russian menace to be resisted everywhere. Now, this was poppycock because Russia was prostrate at the end of World War II. They lost 27 million or more citizens. They had 32,000 industrial enterprises destroyed, and 70,000 towns and villages disappeared from the map. So the neocons of that day, the Burns, the Acheson, the Forrestal, the Dulles brothers, they got their way, and eventually over the course of the next 3-4 years, were able to implement a Cold War. I would say they were the largest proponent of the Cold War. And of course, by being aggressive, it created a response from Russia. So it became sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So now we have this Cold War, which lasted from 45 to 91. We had 46 years of nuclear deterrence, particularly after Russia got this nuclear weapons in 49. But there were numerous close calls and trouble spots and hot wars. Berlin in 48, China in 49. Interestingly, the right-wingers, the extremists, blamed the Democrats for losing China when in fact it was Chiang Kai-shek who lost China by being a brutal dictator who was totally corrupt and had no ability to galvanize the people against the communist revolution. Of course, we had the hot war in Korea, 50 to 53, the thing that started my interest in foreign affairs. Totally unnecessary. We didn't need to break up Korea at the end of World War II. We did it because we didn't want the entire Korea being under the control of nearby China and Russia. So we said, let's cut it in half, and we're going to have a pro-Western portion in the South, and the North can be communist. But the ruler of South Korea was a brutal dictator, Syngman Rhee, who killed, tortured, imprisoned thousands of anybody who opposed his regime, including communists. And so we had a totally unnecessary war. Cuba, which again, the thing that really broke my support of US foreign policy, we've been sanctioning now for 65 years. We used Cuba as a piggy bank. We took it over from Spain in the Spanish-American War of 1898. And we intervened 3 or 4 or 5 times in the first part of the 20th century. And then in 33, we helped, after the installation of Fulgencio Batista, he basically was our man in Havana. The last ambassador to Cuba before Castro, a guy named Smith said the U.S. ambassador to Cuba is the second most powerful man in Cuba, if not the most popular man, powerful man. And that, of course, ended with the revolution, something that we could not accept or abide by. Indonesia. We don't hear much about what happened in Indonesia, but there's a thing called the Jakarta method. It was in 65, 66, there was efforts at progressive left-wing reform of Indonesia government. We couldn't stomach that because we said that's going to turn communist. So we poured tremendous money into the brutal leaders, the autocrats in Indonesia, resulted in upwards of 1 million left-wing progressives and a few communists killed by the Indonesian government. And it was such a brutal, horrible thing that that we coined the term Jakarta method was coined to represent US efforts to overthrow and destroy any left-wing efforts, particularly in Latin America, that they thought could turn that country communist, which of course had no bearing on our national security whatsoever. So we had several Latin America interventions using the Jakarta method. And by the way, there's a great book called The Jakarta Method, which I highly recommend. Then, of course, we had the hot war in Vietnam. Again, we overturned the ability for a free election to allow Vietnam to be a unified country after the 55 Geneva Conference. We lost soldiers actually we had casualties beginning as early as 59. So that was a 16-year period where these 58,000 soldiers were killed essentially for nothing. Vietnam got unified and now they're a major trading partner and an ally. So it's understandable now that, well, sorry, that finishes up that portion, but now we get to the second watershed year, 1991, at the 46 years after 45. Again, we'll talk about two major events, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the first Cold War, because essentially we're now in a second one, and the massive US troop buildup for the first Gulf War in the Middle East. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, it gave America a second opportunity at a peace dividend. Now, we did have a peace dividend right after World War II. Between 45 and 48, Truman did bring down military spending by over 90%. We went from 12 million military personnel at the end of the war to 1.5 million in 48. But it was during this period that the hardliners took control of Truman. We had the Churchill speech in Fulton, Missouri in April of 46, saying the Iron Curtain is coming down and doom is approaching. Then we had the Truman Doctrine in February of 47, where he declared that we must resist communism wherever it appears in Western Europe, Turkey, Greece, France, Italy. We poured hundreds of millions of dollars into, again, brutal governments in Turkey and Italy, in Greece rather, to prevent a communist takeover, which was unlikely to happen in any event and would have no bearing on our national security if it did. And getting back to Stalin with his sphere of influence, he paid lip service to these communist efforts in Western Europe. He really did not support them because it wasn't in their core interests of having this cordon sanitaire around Russia, which were the Eastern European states that he controlled through fear, intimidation, and so forth. So the neocons feared with the end of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Cold War, it could be the end of the military complex, which was roaring throughout this 46-year period. They warned of renewed economic decline. And then the second major factor in 1991, of course, was the infusion of massive US and other country troops into the Middle East, so that now the US was exerting sole hegemony over the Middle East through this infusion of troops. And it was done not to go after Islamic jihadists, but the secular Saddam Hussein, who was our ally 10 years earlier in the war against Iran. So the US toppled him quickly, and our presence remained in the Middle East to both ensure a steady supply of oil, to democratize a backward authoritarian regime, but also to establish US global dominance in the region. And that begins the topic, the concept of blowback, which we really didn't hear about much till this 1991 effort to remake the Middle East in our image. So in 93, we had the first World Trade Center attack. In June of 96, the Khobar Tower bombing. August of 96, the East Africa embassy bombings, and the 2000 USS Cole bombing. And then that brings us, so all of that blowback was percolating through the 90s. And then in 2001, we have again two major events to discuss. The first one was the neocons, which had been working all through the 90s to work their way into power. And some of them were in the Reagan and the George H.W. Bush administration, but they really got control under another neophyte like Truman, as far as foreign affairs, George W. Bush. And they were able to promote their concept, which they created in 1997 in the nonprofit, the Project for a New American Century, which was to create US global dominance, particularly in the Middle East. And then the second major event, which was the 9/11 attacks. And now we've gone, and this was the official start of the war on terror and perpetual war, because from 45 through 91, we were conducting military operations in a number of countries, which was an informal perpetual war. Now the war on terror, which was identified as such, was the perpetual war that we now we still exist in 24 years later. So that is a very brief, I admit, overview. And I'm going to get to our third objective now, which is how should we act to achieve a peaceful world for ourselves and future generations? Well, the most important thing is for every single American to make a commitment to seek peace and oppose perpetual war. It's something I did starting in 1963, and although I did not do it throughout my succeeding 62 years, I've been doing it now since 2002 and will till the end. It's not a bad idea to join a local or national peace organization. I currently head up a local one based in Glen Ellen, Illinois, Chicago's western suburbs, which is named the West Suburban Peace Coalition. We all need to support candidates with anti-war position. Now, the problem with that is there are none. There's virtually no pure anti-war person in Congress or in the administration that I'm aware of. I guess one that comes close is Bernie. Bernie has spoken out very eloquently against perpetual war. He's called our conduct enabling the genocide in Israel as war crimes. But his focus remains, always has been and remains, domestic affairs, opposing income inequality, opposing oligarchic and corporate greed, and working to bring valid social services to the less needy in the country. We should all be lobbying our congresspersons and president to end perpetual war. We should attend, when we can, anti-war events, and I guess this session tonight would constitute one. And we should also become informed. And I know a lot of you folks are, I'm sure, very informed, but too many Americans know virtually nothing about perpetual war and the vagaries of US foreign policy. Historian philosopher Noam Chomsky put it very well when he said, the general population doesn't know what is happening and doesn't even know that it doesn't know. Now, part of this is due to people being focused on what's right in front of their face and being completely mystified about what's going on in the world. But a lot of it has to do with our media, which is totally worthless. The mainstream media is worthless, so I recommend turning off TV news. It's worthless. Utilize fact-based, peace-oriented websites, books, and magazines. The one I recommend, if you spend a half hour with it every morning, it's called antiwar.com. Some of you, I'm sure, use it. You get current events on these machinations around the world, and you get great opinion pieces. And full disclosure, I'm an occasional columnist at antiwar.com. So to conclude, let's all do whatever we can to prevent perpetual war from becoming our children's war. That concludes my talk, and I'll be happy to take any questions or comments you might have at this time.
Oh, hello. Well, I'll ask a first question. I haven't been called upon, but I will. Hi, Walt.
Okay.
Now, there have been hundreds of thousands of demonstrators in the streets on the Palestine issue, and quite right too, both in the US, the UK, and other European countries. But there's hardly any mass opposition to the Ukraine conflict. How do you explain that?
It's extremely hard because I've been horrified by the Ukraine. I'm horrified by what happened in 2014, 8 years before it started, when we engaged in a coup, which is the very last thing we should ever be engaged in, that set the stage 8 years later for the Russian attack. It's hard to explain. I think part of it, I know at the beginning of the war, there was sympathy for Ukraine because it's been pitched. Part of the reason, Francis, is it's pitched as a totally non-justified invasion by Russia. That's totally their effort to recreate the Soviet Union. And that wording was actually used, that if we don't stop what Russia is doing in Ukraine, they're going to go after the rest of Western Europe and recreate the Soviet Union. And I know tons of people that bought into that. So there's no massive destruction that we can see like there is in Gaza. So I think the majority of the people both either support what we're doing because they believe the lies they're told about the war being unprovoked, and they don't care because it's out of sight, out of mind. I mean, there's been a virtual news blackout on the war in mainstream media because it's a lost cause. So I think you got two things going there. They believe the lies, so they think that the war is justified, but they also aren't even seeing it anymore because it's disappeared from mainstream media.
Could I just say, make a comment and follow up? You mentioned in your talk that no U.S. servicemen have been killed in Ukraine.
Yes.
That's probably not true. It's quite
Okay.
possible that hundreds have been killed, but that's a top secret information, whether they're CIA or special forces. But it's very doubtful whether Ukraine have been fighting by themselves. There's plenty of evidence, I think, that NATO troops are on the ground in Ukraine.
Yes, I did hear and read reports of both UK and US troops on the ground helping out as advisors, not on the front lines, not firing guns, although who knows, maybe they are, but there's been zero comment of any casualties.
Okay, who else has got a mic? Go ahead and get up front.
Get up here?
Yeah, well, just go behind the mic, see if we can hear you.
Thanks for the very enlightening presentation. Since you've been following hot wars and cold wars and how bad American media is, do you have a feeling, it seemed like during Vietnam, information was coming into the media better, and it seems like every hot war we have, or cold war, or anything, it's just all secret. We murder journalists, Israel murders journalists, everything's quiet, hush hush, secret, corrupt. Is that how it seems to you the last few decades? Is that little by little the media is less and less accurate, less and less knowledgeable, poor reporting? I'd like to hear your comment about that.
Yes, very definitely. For example, a huge difference was because we had a draftees were going to Vietnam, so that caused this massive protests around the country that got it. They could not publicize it, and a number of people in Congress, people in government were voicing their opposition to the war because they realized it was killing thousands of innocent boys that were being drafted and going to war. So that's not been a factor since then because we got rid of the draft. So really what we're doing now, the wars we're doing now are all done in secret with a private military. And so there is no coverage of it, and there's not enough people being affected by it to make a stink. And so it's brilliant policy by the government to engage in perpetual war without the public either rising up in mass or even knowing about it. It makes it much easier to conduct these wars, whether it's with bombs, proxies, sanctions, or belligerent diplomacy. Regarding diplomacy, we have people in the military saying that we expect to be at war with China in a couple of years. And that's crazy. They're a major nuclear power. So we have two potential nuclear wars, one with Russia if there's any mistake made in Ukraine, and one with China if we don't find a way to pull back from this belligerent confrontation diplomacy.
I would like to know if you've heard of Smedley Butler, and if so, can you comment on what you know about him?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that. I wrote an article about Smedley Butler. It's called War is Still a Racket. His book in 1936 was War is a Racket. He won 2 congressional medals of honor for his work on military interventions in China and in Latin America. Interventions that were totally unnecessary. And after he retired, he had an epiphany, and he spent the rest of his life calling out the perpetual war of the time, which was interventions mainly in Latin America to promote U.S. business interests. He had a famous quote saying, Al Capone operated in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. So Smedley Butler is one of my heroes.
All right, we'll get you and then we'll get Ron online. So go ahead.
What do you think of Trump saying he wants to take over Panama, Canada, Greenland, and Gaza? What do you think of that?
It is so bizarre and insane that it's hard to even talk calmly about it. But it's interesting, on my list of countries that were involved in some form of perpetual war, the last 2 I listed were the 2 that he added to the list in trying to intimidate Panama into giving us back the Panama Canal, and trying to intimidate Denmark, a NATO ally, to give us Greenland, because it's really helpful for our, both seizures would be helpful to our national security. Trump talked peace during the campaign. He said that the Ukraine war was crazy and I can end it in one day. He didn't really say much about Gaza, as I recall, but as soon as he got in, he is funneling billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine. So he's gone back on his promise to end it in one day and to stop it. And he's gone all in on completing the genocidal ethnic cleansing of Gaza by taking the 2 million Palestinians out and redeveloping Gaza, obviously for valuable Israeli waterfront property, something that his son-in-law proposed over a year ago. So it's funny, he's in his DNA, he's not a warmonger. He didn't start any wars in his first term, and he doesn't really seem to relish the idea of going to war with other countries. But he is so bizarre in his statements that it almost makes no difference, because he almost stumbled us into a war with Iran in his first term, and he almost stumbled us into a war with North Korea with his belligerency. So he is I feel he's a deranged wild card. I really feel he's disintegrating before our eyes as far as making any sensible statements that could lead to peace. So I'm not optimistic. The short answer is I'm not optimistic that we're going to see peace under him, because in Ukraine, it's a losing proposition, and he doesn't want to be presiding over a war that's lost.
Okay, Ron, go ahead. You're online.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I do want to compliment you on your presentation and the actual distinction of the two sides in this operation. One based in nation states coming out of World War II and the potential production that would have occurred under Roosevelt's direction of taking up the Allies, Russia and China especially, and ending colonialism. And then the fact that colonialism with Roosevelt's death was maintained by this, let's say, what's referred to as a deep state, but it's actually the old British Empire controlling the finances, by the blocking of Wallace in the vice presidency and making the shift to Truman. They had a puppet to actually go along with the policies to maintain the colonial empire. So we didn't get the alliance for development with American methods and sovereignty around the world. We got a threat with the thermonuclear strikes on Japan that told Russia to stay in line and everything else. And that really stood, and they were moving for strikes on Russia until the point that the Russians developed the hydrogen bomb before we got it. So they had to change gears, and you see that in the life of Burton Russell. So my point here is a lot of that dynamic, and as you were describing, perpetual wars to maintain this dominance as the United States got pulled into this being the enforcer for the continuation of colonialism. You now have that coming to a head because that paper bubble that they've created rather than real productive physical economy is crashing. And they got to make sure nobody rises, whether it's the Russians, the Chinese, or a combination like, the BRICS. So I was going to ask you, what do you see this alliance of the BRICS, which includes Russia and China, as people know, and the whole global South, projects like the new canals and the ports in Lima, high-speed rail lines, China lifting 800 million people out of poverty. I mean, doing credit policies as we've done in the past, and we should return not only to our own system of credit, but in joining that, we've got the biggest industrial boom facing the world. But this empire faction finally gets the defeat it should have had coming out of the American Revolution, out of the Civil War, defeating that divide and conquer, out of World War II when we stopped fascism. And I dropped into the chat a document that's called the Liars Bureau, which details some of these operations that have to now be brought public. So I think to look at this question of pessimism, as you brought up, it really finally lands in the lap of us, the United States, the people, since the party structure is dominated by this and it's really falling apart, that we as a people have to demand this collaboration with these other nations for development. We've got to come back to running our own credit independent of a central bank called the Federal Reserve. And there's multiple projects, water systems out west, the Oasis plan in the Middle East that we can become part of. So I just wanted your comments on this American system of credit, like you were referring to in Roosevelt, that allowed us to win the war, under Kennedy and some of the programs that were being pushed. And how do we come back to that, joining and working with the BRICS and building some of these projects ourselves, putting ourselves back to work, and especially the young people.
Right. Well, thank you. Good question. Besides BRICS, there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes some of the same members as in BRICS. But going forward, more and more countries are going to be joining these non-allied. They're not non-American, but they're non-allied. They're saying we don't want to follow a U.S. worldwide dominating hegemon. We want a multipolar world, and there is going to be no stopping it. And it doesn't appear that anybody in the United States Congress or government is recognizing that fact. They must know it. And maybe they're just in denial and delusion that we can remain the dominant power. I mean, Biden spent his whole 4 years saying, we are this indispensable nation. Now, and I wrote a piece recently that throughout his administration, he is bombing and sanctioning and intimidating countries, and China is going into these countries and investing. They're building infrastructure. And we say, oh, they're building infrastructure to destroy us. That's crazy. That's crazy thinking. So there was a news report a few days ago that Rubio, the new Secretary of State, did offer a very short comment that referring to the possible decline of U.S. unipolar dominance. So that's the one encouraging sign I've seen since Trump's taken over. But Biden was in complete denial on that because he had this 50-year-long career where he was a Cold War fanatic. And, you know, we have to be optimistic, but it doesn't seem we're conducting ourselves in a way that's preparing the inevitable decline of American worldwide dominance.
Okay, Charlie, you're next.
Yes, Walt. For many, many years, I've been a member of the World Federalist Association and United Nations Associate. And at no time during your talk, which is very good talk. However, I noticed you had not one time did you mention the United Nations. Do you feel it has any role to play in bringing about an end to this perpetual war situation?
That's a good question because recently I read a piece by one of my friends in the anti-war community. He said that basically the US in the last couple, 2-3 years, including under Biden, has totally made an end run around international law as provided by the UN. In other words, we are treating the UN as irrelevant. For example, every year for the last 10, 20 years, in the General Assembly, they've passed a resolution demanding, not requesting, but demanding we end the blockade of Cuba. And it's like 128-2, the two being the US and Israel. Israel's got our back on Cuba. We've got their back on genocide in Gaza. So, and with the Security Council, and we vetoed all the resolutions demanding that, requiring Israel to stop the genocide in Gaza. So we have really made an end run and are making the UN irrelevant. So I'm not optimistic that they can play a good part. For example, also what Israel has stopped, and we've supported them in ending the UN relief agency that's bringing food and supplies into Gaza. So that's a UN function that we're stopping. And we're also sanctioning the International Criminal Court, which is allied or is part of the UN. We're saying they're illegal. They can't indict anybody in Israel for war crimes and genocide because they're irrelevant. So there doesn't seem to be much the UN can do, primarily because we're blocking them, and we've created, instead of using international law, we've created what we call the rules-based order. The rules-based order is whatever the United States says is international law.
Okay, Jonathan, we'll get you, and then we'll go to you, Francis.
Thanks, Walt, for a great talk. My question is specific to if the American people think that our foreign policy is one of an angel, and we all know who researched this, it's more like a bully, a belligerent, out of control bull in a china shop. What are our international and domestic tools to penalize the media for parroting the line of the warmongers, to propagandize the people to believe that somehow it's not as bad as, of course, 95% of the population of the world realizes it is when the United States government acts like this out of control bully?
From the US media has totally censored any pushback against these wars. No anti-war pundit or congressman or administration official is given time. I mean, they give time to Lindsey Graham, who's promoting the US promote Israel attacking Iran. I mean, he's actually promoting the creation of a catastrophic war, and they put him on TV to do that. So we don't have a venue to do that, but there's tons and tons of people that are bringing good information to the populace if they would just utilize these services. Like I mentioned, antiwar.com, but there's Consortium News. And we've not been able to make any breakthrough in getting anti-war, anti-perpetual war opinions on mainstream news. And for example, in the campaign, the progressive media totally ignored foreign policy. I mean, totally ignored it, because they couldn't say that the genocide in Gaza was good, so they ignored it. They know that we've lost in Ukraine, and that Ukraine is on the brink of defeat, which will probably occur sometime this year, and result in almost everything that Russia wants, but will include a continuation of a rump state of Iran. So they just ignored it completely. And not one, and a lot of this goes back, it goes back to, I call the McGovern syndrome of 72. You know, McGovern was the greatest anti-war candidate in my lifetime. He campaigned to end the Vietnam War, and he won 2 states. He got crushed. And since then, any candidates for Congress or national or for presidency are avoiding the anti-war position because they see what happened in McGovern, and they see that there's no upside to having that position. Now, maybe if Bernie had gotten nominated and elected in 16, we would have a much different foreign policy today. But unfortunately, that did not happen.
You got a follow-up, go ahead.
Yeah, and we didn't even hear what happened to Dennis Kucinich. So that's even more glaring example of in the media, you can count on it that you won't be punished for causing mass death. But if you or I yelled fire in a crowded theater and someone died as a result of that, we'd be put into a court of law as responsible for that death. So we need to strengthen our legal framework and infrastructure to make media people who deliberately propagandize the American people culpable for murder.
Okay, Francis, go ahead.
Okay. Tulsi Gabbard has voiced her opposition to perpetual wars and also opposition to regime change wars. There's a very active smear campaign going on against her right now. But if she is approved, what kind of impact do you expect her to make, if any? That's the first part of the question. And secondly, the nature of war has changed within the last 3 years. We have AI, drones, and hypersonic missiles. So what kind of impact will those major technological advancements have in terms of war and peace?
Well, regarding Tulsi Gabbard, yeah, I was a big supporter of Tulsi Gabbard when she was running for president. I'm hearing things that she's sort of moderating and shifting away from some of her anti-war positions. I understand, although I'm not certain, that she's not opposing what's going on in Gaza. I hope I'm wrong on that. I think she'll be confirmed because I think that the Republican Party, the Republican senators will not vote against her in order to keep pleasing Trump. So I think she will get elected, and I hopefully will see her as a breath of fresh air. As far as the new technologies, the one that I'm not familiar with AI, but the hypersonic missiles, I believe Russia fired a hypersonic missile that destroyed a massive amount of war material in Ukraine. And it was a warning that Ukraine and the US must be very careful as far as when they attack inside Russia, because Russia's got this weapon that will drastically cause enormous damage, and it's going to be like nothing we've ever seen. So that's the only one that I'm familiar with, but I think it is a potential game changer in helping to get that war ended sooner, because it makes, I think, Ukraine and the US and NATO allies realize they have absolutely no chance of prevailing under any terms that are really favorable to them.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I heard the doomsday clock is the closest it's been to zero since 1947. Do you agree?
Well, I not only agree, but I was very disappointed that they moved it up just 1 second. I wrote a piece called "The 89 Seconds to Midnight," which was 1 second more than it was 2 years ago, feels more to me like 8 or 9 seconds to midnight. Because just like in the 62 missile crisis, where we had 13 days where we didn't know if we were going to wake up the next day, We have spent every single day since February 24th, 22, under the prospect that one crazy military person, one miscalculation could create a nuclear war between the US and Russia. And Biden said this on day one of the war, and yet he proceeded to do nothing to end it. He never talked to Putin. He never used diplomacy, and he gave weapons that went over Russia's red line. So he risked nuclear war with every action he took during his 4 years. Trump said he wouldn't do that, but as soon as he got in, I understand that he's green-lighted, giving more billions of, not stopping the billions of dollars that are in the pipeline. So that's not very encouraging at all for de-escalating what could be nuclear war. So I think, and Code Pink, by the way, also wrote a piece very critical of it only going 1 second from 90 to 89, that it should be, in fact, they've advocated what they call a peace clock, whereas midnight is peace, and then it's the opposite. In other words, as efforts are made to wind down wars, the clock goes backwards. So I'm very disappointed in the 1 second move up. I don't think it does anything to really reflect the danger that we're in today.
Okay, Jake, you're up next. Unmute and ask your question. Jake, your hand's up. Ask your question. Jake.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. I got two questions. Number one, Putin invaded Ukraine, not the other way around.
Right.
So who do you think is at fault here? Number one. Number two, excuse me. You call what's going on in Gaza a genocide, but who is responsible for starting the whole thing?
All right. Well, that's two questions. All right. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not justified. It was a violation of international law, but it was inevitable. What we did beginning 8 years ago set the stage for an eventual invasion for Russia to keep NATO nukes off their border, pure and simple. When we instigated and supported a coup in 2014, we were committing an act of war against Ukrainian democracy, which no longer exists. And we had 8 years to correct the problem. Putin used, during those 8 years, he used diplomacy, he used begging, he used common sense, he used facts. In November of 2021, he said, here's what we need. We need security on our border. You must accept our national security.
Oh, Putin did none of that.
Yes. Well, all right, let me finish. You can challenge me. The Russians said, we have to discuss our national security. This is their number one issue. And we said, Russia's national security concerns are not on the agenda for discussion. At that point, he said, well, then I have no choice. So, and I know a lot of people believe what you're saying, that, that Russia just invaded them.
I consider that bullshit. Putin is the instigator here, not the other way around.
Okay, well, no, and millions of people believe that. So I'm just saying this is my opinion, and I think the majority, I think you will be hard pressed to find a single reputable political scientist or historian who would agree with you. I know it's your opinion, and it's the opinion of millions of people.
Okay, what about Israel and Gaza?
Well, I've called, first of all, Israel has been destroying the Palestinian people in their homeland for 77 years, since 1948. They've been maintained for years, I think 2006, the world's largest open-air prison. October 7th was blowback. And guess what? Israel's lost. They completely destroyed their credibility around the world. The world, most of the world considers what they're doing genocide, as I do. They have not defeated.
Do you think, do the suicide bombers have any credibility?
Suicide bombers are a tactic. their murder, but their tactic of, in the case of Hamas, that was blowback. That was something that when you are brutalizing a people and keeping them in a prison for 77 years and destroying their lives.
Well, all I can say is that's an excuse that's not going to stand.
Okay, Jake, we gotta move on.
It becomes a circular process, and if that's what happens, it'll continue to go around in circles. Is all I'm saying.
Is what Hamas did any different than the Warsaw Rebellion in 44 Germany, in Poland rather? Blowback is what you can expect when a country is brutalized, and the UN Charter allows for people to resist militarily if they're being brutalized to the extent that the Palestinians were. Doesn't make it right. It's just it's inevitable. See, just like the Russian invasion was inevitable.
Well, then it's inevitable that the Israelis will respond the way they have.
With genocide? Is that a good way? Is that a valid response?
No, I'm saying the problems on both sides. It takes two to tango.
All right, that's a valid opinion.
Move on. All right, you're next. I'll get you. Charlie, I'll get you, and I'll get you, Ron, and after these two guys are having had questions. Go ahead.
I would question that Putin is not winning this war. This war is coming down to a stalemate. Maybe Trump has talked about being able to get a settlement, which I think is about the best we're going to get out of this. Yeah, no, it's a Korean War.
Well, what did you have a question?
I have a question.
Yeah, my question is, will Trump be able to get the settlement which we badly need?
Well, he's given every indication that he will not get a settlement because he hasn't accepted the fact that Ukraine has no chance of winning, and that the only settlement will result in no NATO for Ukraine, the 4 oblasts becoming a permanent part of Russia along with Ukraine, and there will be security guarantees for the remainder of Ukraine that's not now under Russian control. It's unlikely that he would be willing to accept that because there would be tremendous political consequences to do so, and he knows that. So he's in a bind. He's in a pickle because it's virtually impossible to conceive that he could get a settlement that would make it seem like the United States prevailed. That's the problem he faces. Russia's got all the cards in their hands to get the settlement that they're seeking.
Okay, Ron, you're next. Go ahead. Ron.
Charlie's got his hand up.
What, Charlie? I know, I'll get Charlie next. Go ahead, sir. I'll get Charlie next.
That's great. Because Charlie likes to come in after me. Anyway, first of all, I'd like to back up the analysis that the speaker laid out in terms of the dynamics involved in this. But I'd like to go back to where we started in terms of what's orchestrating this is the fact that coming out of World War II, an American system policy did not win out in terms of the post-war policy. The empire policy did. And we've been discussing the Middle East here, but that's a funny term, Middle East. Middle of what? Well, the Far East, India was the end of the British Empire. And then you had the Middle East, and then you had the Western portion. So the Middle East should actually be looked at for what it actually is, the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and Europe. One of the most important spots in the globe. And if you can keep that destabilized, well, then you're in a position to manipulate a lot of things if you're controlling the world through central banks, which is really the same thing we're still in, is that fight. So when did the coup in Ukraine, for example, start? Well, that was, everybody knows now looking at this, it started in 2014. And then it was, what was it, 20 years, not 20 years, but 14 years later, or 8 years later, you have the invasion. Well, we don't hear about the 12,000 people who got killed in the western section there that actually was part of the provocation. And then, like the speaker says, we can't have NATO on our borders. Secondly, what happened just before that orchestrated coup by Victoria Nuland and others is the president, Yukhanovich, of Ukraine was being pressured to join the West, give up any ties to Russia, and that wasn't feasible for him. So he decided to stay neutral. But not only did he decide to stay neutral, he took a trip, which is also not talked about. Where did he go? Well, he went to China in November and December of 2013, and he discussed how could Ukraine become a gateway into Europe for the Belt and Road in this new development. So that was in November, December, and then the coup was put under operation and pulled off by the next couple of months, taken credit for by Victoria Nuland and others. Same kind of thing in the Middle East, coming out of World War II, massive potential for development. But the British, who actually created the culture of Zionism, both the Jewish version and also the Christian version, and they use this to create these control operations for empire. And so they just unleash this. And the problem is the American people think about things like ball games, and we pick sides, and we don't. So I'm coming back to where we're looking at this thing. We're in a situation where that financial fight between colonialism and credit directed by nations is coming to a head. And the fundamental thing on the American side is we got to look at.
Are you asking a question or just lecturing here?
Well, one thing is people have to understand, if we're going to get it off particular subjects and actually look at the dynamics underway, because otherwise we just say Putin's the enemy and we don't even have a clue who Putin is. All right. So my question is, again, looking at the BRICS, looking at the development program, if we took something like this Oasis plan that would drop canals from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea and irrigate the entire place, not just Israel and Palestine area, but the 6 nations in the area. The biggest problem is the lack of water. Biggest problem out west in the United States is the lack of water. There's policies we can implement. So I'm saying, going back to this policy of an American credit, that alliance of the United States working with other countries for development. That's the fundamental question. You break the back of the empire. You want to stop these wars? Cut off the money.
I'm good
We're
with that.
a dumb giant forcing and protecting the empire of a nation and a network, an empire, not a nation, that's looting us to the bone, taking down production, I mean, it's ridiculous. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution, and we're acting like we're clueless. I'm finished for the time being, but we've got to get an attention span.
We'll get you in the rebuttal period, okay, for anything, different things. Charlie, you're going, go ahead.
Well, did he want to answer Ron's question?
Go ahead, Charlie, what?
All right. We recently had, Walt, 2 programs on the topic of which was China from 2 totally different perspectives. I understand that China has an army of over 2 million men and women in uniform. And I've seen these parades, mass parades of military formations, as well as comparisons of the size of the U.S. Navy versus the Chinese, with increased assertion of, do you see any increased assertion of China in foreign affairs, and that this aspect of China will be used as justification by the Republicans to increase the military budget?
Well, we have so many people in Congress and in the administration who are saying that our biggest enemy today is China, because they're so large. They've got either the biggest or very close to the biggest economy in the world, and they're out to not destroy us, but to become the dominant world power, the hegemon of, certainly the hegemon of the Far East, just like we're the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. And we're ramping up belligerent rhetoric that is not helpful to solving any problems as far as establishing a decent relationship with them. And I think the new Secretary of State, Mark Rubio, was before he was still a senator, was saying, our number one enemy is China. And I think there's a lot of people in the Congress and in the administration that feel the same way. So now we've got this problem with China that it's kind of self-created. We've got the problem in Ukraine and we got the problem in Gaza. So we're spread pretty thin. And there's no real positive spin that you can put on America being successful in any of these spheres. So there's no hot shooting going on in China. It would seem to me that would be one of the first places we should de-escalate this belligerent rhetoric. You know, when Biden got in 4 years ago, he said, we have to beat China in the 21st century. That set the whole tone for an aggressive foreign policy with China that wasn't diplomacy, but was ramping up tensions, needless tensions. So there's nothing positive on the horizon as far as our relationship with China, because we're not backing off of this belief that they're doing everything they can to weaken us. You know, whether it's with technology or AI, or with exerting their influence in their sphere of influence. They've definitely created, in their minds at least, a Monroe Doctrine for their area of the world. And we want to stop that, even though we've got a Monroe Doctrine that we're guarding jealously in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, I'll get you, Doug, after I get Mike here.
Bill.
After I get.
All right, why are not these peace groups, okay, since the media is not doing their job, for one reason or the other, corruption or agendas, why are not the peace groups going to the headquarters of all these big media companies with misinformation and disinformation? And why aren't you protesting there? Like, have some intelligent signs and circle the headquarters, probably in downtown New York or DC, where all this bad media information. I can't even watch PBS anymore; it's so corrupt. And NPR. So why aren't they out there? I got a two-part question. Why aren't you guys protesting the bad media companies in this country? One, and then two, is it really the decision makers that our corrupt government, where we have representatives and senators getting kickbacks from all the MIC companies, the military industrial complex, and getting kickbacks? I mean, America's turned into one of the more corrupt modern countries, first world, whatever we are, first, second world country. We've turned into a very corrupt country. We've dropped really low compared to a lot of good countries in our corruption level. So isn't that who's really deciding? Is the corrupt politicians we have that get kickbacks every year for their elections? Whatever. Those are the decision makers. They vote. Those 500 people in DZ are the ones that say yes or no. Not the hundreds of millions of us. So aren't they following the money? That's the corruption? And then the media, isn't that corrupt too?
Well, getting back to the first part, I'm not aware that peace organizations have been doing anything to protest at media headquarters. I know they've spent a lot of time protesting in the halls of Congress. They've ambushed congressmen and asked them why they're spending $170 billion on the lost war in Ukraine, and why they're spending $20 billion providing 50,000 tons of bombs to Israel to utterly obliterate Gaza and possibly the West Bank. Code Pink was out yesterday picketing around the White House, saying signs that a war criminal lives here. So their focus, and I think Code Pink is one of the best at doing this, is focused on confronting our Congress, which, as you say, is bought and sold by the military industrial complex. It's unbelievable the millions in cash that are going to them. And Many of them are fervent supporters of our perpetual wars. And some of them are silent, but they take the money and they don't do anything to push back. And the only one I know in the last couple, 2-3 years that I've heard push back a little bit was Bernie Sanders. So yes, it's a shame that peace organizations are apparently not doing enough to put pressure on the media. I've been appalled during the campaign to watch the progressive commentators on MSNBC and CNN just excoriate Trump as being this horrible, corrupt monster that he is, and say not one word about the way we are destroying Ukraine as a functioning state. It's a dead state right now, and how we're enabling the genocide of over 2 million people in Gaza. Not one word. And that's what we get from, their jobs are dependent on being silent. There is almost total censure by the mainstream media. And we don't have the resources and the ability to make inroads on that. So yes, that's a terrible situation.
Thanks, Walt. Some of the most popular sites for information that is outside of the military, congressional, industrial complex sphere of influence, really popular with high school and college aged news viewing public. One is called worldbeyondwar.org.
Yes.
And another one is called The Gray Zone. And then there's another one called Covert Action Magazine. And it seems like there's a unifying theme of a lot of these sites and organizations that have popularity amongst the youth, where they acknowledge that maybe in election time, the US public would be well served in being fully aware of the power of the no confidence vote. The reason I bring that up is the no confidence vote is used in other parts of the world for big ticket items. And just for example, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, at his confirmation hearing, there's a little bit pushback that he had been an arms contractor previously, and that the amount of years had not gone by yet where you're allowed to then become a cabinet member, especially a defense secretary, after you're an arms company contractor, for him legally to be confirmed as the defense secretary. And I think there just has to be some payback in DC for things like that from the public, and maybe no confidence vote is a way to go. Now, I don't know if that could be a no confidence vote for the entire system, or a no confidence vote for a specific, source of lobbying funding for candidates. But at the ballot booth, how can we creatively strengthen our ability to punish them when they break their own laws?
Great question. Getting back to punishing the war party and candidates who promote perpetual war, it was one of the reasons Harris lost. I understand she got 6 million less votes in 24 than Biden got in 20. I think she got 75 million to his 81 million. And polling shows that the number one reason was US enabling the genocide in Israel. That was totally ignored in the mainstream media as a factor in the election. And now, 2-3 months after the election, there doesn't appear to be one word offered in the media of this being a factor in her loss. So they're in denial. The Democratic establishment, of course, the Republicans are a lost cause, but the Democratic establishment is in denial that bellicose perpetual war policies, particularly enabling the genocide in Gaza, but also Ukraine, is a factor, and maybe a big factor, in electoral defeat. And unless they come to recognize that there may be no chance for them to get back in power.
Okay,
Just as a quick follow-up,
all right, we gotta go to
those
Doug
guys
Big-
that confirmed Lloyd Austin, even though it was against the law for him to become defense secretary, and Lloyd Austin himself will never go to jail. And that's just my point. The government is acting in treason.
Yeah.
That's just business as usual now in regards to military matters in the United States Congress, or whether you're a Republican, Democrat, or whatever.
Yes, the Congress had to pass an exception to his being ineligible to be the defense secretary because of his previous work in the defense industry. But there's a revolving door between military personnel at various levels of leadership and the defense industry. They typically retire and go into the defense industry and make a lot more money promoting things like the F-35, which is a $1 trillion boondoggle that doesn't work.
Okay, Doug Bigley. Doug, you got your hand up. Doug? Doug Binkley, you got your hand up. All right, Doug, I'm gonna take you down. Wait for you. All right, Doug, hello, okay, Doug, you're up. Unmute and ask your question. All right.
3, 2, 1.
All right, Doug, I'm gonna lower your hand. All right, go ahead, Dan.
All right, Dan Weinberg, I got a question. The big picture. I mean, governments have come and gone, and they had too many wars. Greece, Rome, the Nazis, Russia. So do you see America ending their 150-year reign of the earth?
Well,
because of having too many wars.
I think the perpetual war, which has been going on for roughly 80 years now, is eventually going to spell the end of American worldwide dominance. After World War II, we became the dominant world power. And we spent the last 80 years expanding that power at every turn. And it's inevitably, we're in decline, particularly with things like BRICS and SHO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it's going to be in 2, 3, 5 years, there's going to be a major shift in American power. And hopefully it won't cause us to stumble into a major war, a nuclear war in the process. It's very painful to give up world power. And we're resisting it. We've been resisting it for years when it's inevitable that it's unsustainable. Our policies now are unsustainable. We're losing in Ukraine. That's going to be a major loss. We are a pariah of the world for the genocide in Gaza. We appear to be on a collision course with China for no reason whatsoever. And none of this bodes well for America maintaining its status as the top dog in the world. So yes, I don't think it means the end of America, but I think it means the end of American world dominance.
Okay, Andy, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Andy Anderson. I have 2 questions for you. One, you mentioned something called PNAC, the Project for a New American Century.
Yes.
My question is, are you familiar that was used to basically, by the Bush-Cheney administration, create 9/11? And the myth of 9/11 was sold to us by the public. Now, that gave us homeland security in the last 24 years of the military-industrial complex running wild, thinking we're constantly on the guard for terrorists all over the world. Is that your understanding of that, or are you still not? Are you still working with the myth that we were attacked by Osama bin Laden?
No, I'm not on board that, but I understand there was a quote when they first started in '97 that somebody said, we have this plan to implement our domination of the Middle East, U.S. global domination, and it will take a Pearl Harbor type event to implement it. So that's been used as justification for us instigating the 9/11 attacks. So I don't adhere to that, but obviously it's an ominous quote. And I think that when the 9/11 attacks occurred, it unleashed the dogs, it unleashed the neocons to implement their plan for global hegemony in the Middle East.
Okay, my other question was, have you seen any of the information that's emerged that Trump was installed by billionaire predators who fixed the election this year? That Greg Palast, the investigator, is publishing results now. He published a small book before the election saying how Trump stole it. They basically disenfranchised 15 million Democratic voters across the country in over 43 states. It's called the Vigilante Program. It's available on a DVD. The Vigilante, you can watch it for free on the internet. It's how, and this article that I brought today was the billionaire coup is almost complete and no one stopped it. It's on Common Dreams. I'm sorry, Smirking Chimp. It's an article by Tom Hartman. But there's all kinds of articles. You mentioned the mainstream media is worthless. Well,
yes,
the alternate media, several reader-supported sites, there's probably dozens of them that are really good at giving us basic news, you know, the reality of what's happening, because they're reader-supported. They can't be canceled by advertisers. So anyway, that's my comment.
Okay.
Well, I think that there's some basis for what you're saying. Certainly, voter disenfranchisement has been a huge Republican tactic for a number of elections now. It may have cost Kerry the election. It may have cost Gore the election. I don't think it by itself cost Harris the election. I think the biggest factor that in her loss was not breaking with Biden on the Ukraine and the Israeli genocide. But the billionaire money is a huge factor is a factor in Trump's win. And so some of what you've alluded to, I think, is valid, but whether it's is it a conspiracy? I mean, obviously the people involved, this was a plan to help Trump win the election, but I think the biggest factor was his charismatic rhetoric to the voters that are susceptible to that type of message, that are uninformed, and many of them are filled with rage and hate, and the message resonated with them. But had Harris broken with Biden on Gaza, that may have turned the tide in her favor. For example, in '68, Humphrey was totally aligned with Johnson on the Vietnam War, and he tanked the polling. He was in double-digit loss to Nixon, and in the last month, he shifted and started to take an anti-war position, and his polling went up, but it was too little too late. So I think that same effect of that same characteristic affected the Harris campaign, and she made the wrong decision. She didn't break with Biden on the wars.
Okay, I got one last question. Doug Binkley asked me, because of his problems with Zoom, have you ever heard of something called the Budapest Memorandum?
Yes, but I'm not familiar with it. Is that the one about bringing more countries into NATO, including Ukraine? I'm not sure.
Okay.
No, that's the one where in return for Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons, Russia agreed that Germany would be united. I think that's what it is.
All right, he asked the second question. Do you understand what appeasement is? And did you learn about Hitler in school?
Oh, yes. I've spent a lot of time studying World War II and the appeasement issue. And unfortunately, a lot of people and pundits and military and government people use the appeasement issue to say this is no different than Munich in '38, when it's totally different. There is no comparison to it whatsoever. In my opinion. Now, that's my take on it, because Russia had one primary goal from after the coup in 2014, and that was to well, two goals. One, keep NATO off their doorstep with possible nuclear weapons. But secondly, protect the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass. And you've got to understand there was Minsk I and Minsk II, where the Western powers, including Ukraine, said, oh yeah, we're going to give them autonomy. We're going to let them decide if they want to stay with us or be semi-autonomous. And they never intended to implement that. They used it as a subterfuge to build up the Ukraine military to oppose the inevitable Russian invasion. And Germany and France admitted that. They admitted that Minsk II was a fraud to deceive Russia into not attacking, so they would give them time to build up and then wipe out, ultimately destroy the resistance in the Donbass.
Okay, at this point, you've had a question. Charlie, you've had numerous questions.
Come on, I got one quick one.
All right, Charlie, then it'll be the last question. I'm going
It's
to
6:45.
rebuttals.
Here at the college every week, just about, I've heard that 9/11 was a false flag, an inside job done by the United States government in order to send an army into the Middle East. Is there validity to that assertion, Walt?
No, I do not buy into the false flag theory whatsoever. I think I'm 100% sure it was a terrorist attack, blowback. It was the ultimate blowback for our going in 91 and rampaging around the Middle East. But I have doubts about the demolition of the buildings, particularly Building 7.
Okay, Stephanie, you haven't had a question yet. Go ahead. Stephanie, go ahead.
Thank you. Building 7 wasn't hit by anything. So
Right.
how do you account for that? And those buildings, the first buildings, they were demolished. They did that no structural steel building has ever fallen to the ground. It's never burned to the ground. That was a demolition. They pancaked in free fall time. How can you rectify that? And there's been no counter. Well, there's been a couple, but NIST keeps saying that, oh yeah, it was caused by jet fuel. It's just not scientific. It's not.
There's two aspects here. I think it was a terrorist attack using airplanes by Islamic jihadists. But I've read about and listened to discussions of the demolition of Building 7 in particular, which wasn't hit, as well as the demolition of the two Twin Towers. And I've got serious concerns that they may have been demolished as part of that operation.
Right. The firefighters did. They were videoed. They said, hey, we heard explosions, boom, boom, boom. And they didn't really show that after they were videoed on the news channels.
Right. And there was one comment I think that was caught on tape saying Building 7 is ready to come down, which
pull it.
So I have grave concerns that there was some other event besides the terrorist attack that destroyed those buildings. But I'm not at the point where I'm saying it absolutely happened.
Yeah, well, that event led to the Patriot Act, which took away a lot of our rights.
Yes, and still is.
Still is.
Tulsi Gabbard, I guess, was against the Patriot Act, and now because she wants to be Secretary of Intelligence, she's saying that it's okay. It's been fixed.
Okay, I'll have to look into that.
I'm concerned about that.
Yeah, I don't like that either.
All right, Jake, last question. Jake, last question. Jake? All right, we're going to rebuttals. All right, we're going to rebuttals. I'm going to give everybody about 4 minutes or so. No, everybody's going to get about 4. All right.
Apple pie of a
I'll put you down, Jake, for about 4 minutes or so.
Okay, thanks, Walt. In 1938, the late great Orson Welles presented a radio drama program called The War of the Worlds.
Yes, familiar with it.
It's 2025 now, So my math's terrible, but that's a lot of years with huge advancement in the ability to fact check things, especially thanks to the World Wide Web. Thanks, Al Gore, for inventing that single-handedly in his garage. That was
Yes.
So I'll go down the list of some questions that the American public won't ever ask or know to ask if they only go on commercial sites, TV, radio, magazine, the newspaper to get their information. So here's some questions we won't ever ask because we've been well programmed not to ask them. And just provide some subtext. In the Eastern Bloc countries during the Soviet, 44 operatives to every one citizen. That was the ratio. So just imagine a country with trillions of dollars more, way more advanced technology, and a government that's hell-bent on telling every citizen that you're aiding and abetting a country because you're opposed to genocide. Okay, even church groups, like little old ladies my grandmother's age, are now aiding and abetting terrorism because they say genocide is a war crime. But here's some of the questions we're not supposed to ever ask. We're not supposed to ask what country the U.S. promised Russia not to spread offensive weapons any space east of. We're not supposed to ask that question. Another question we're not supposed to ask: are Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria less corrupt governments or more after U.S.? Another question we're never supposed to ask is, what government officials instigated the 2014 Maidan coup? Another very telling question we're not supposed to ever ask is, what information did Julian Assange and WikiLeaks report that was not a fact? Another question we're never supposed to ask in the U.S. public is, what is Operation Timber Sycamore? Another thing we, the people of the United States, are never supposed to ask is, who do you think funded Hamas at its inception? Now, when Orson Welles presented The War of the Worlds, most people thought that it was a program that was on the radio from someone who had a very distinguished and gripping voice and delivery that sounded very authoritarian. Okay, so if you're a George Orwell fan and you put that scenario in your mind of what media can be used when it's brand new, like smartphones, like the World Wide Web, like all kinds of AI added things to all those tools, you can get an idea of how people panicked due to how real the depiction of the danger in the story was. My advice to people, especially young people who have the time and energy to organize around these issues, is to go to worldbeyondwar.org. It's a global movement to end all wars. And I especially suggest that you start with a global security system, an alternative to war. It talks about managing conflict without violence. It talks about creating a culture of peace. And it talks about demilitarizing security that might be very instrumental in the next mass movement to hopefully conduct peaceful democratic mobilization for general strike against this treasonous government and any other treasonous government on earth. To paraphrase, turn your spears, plowshares, and we're going to send your war where it belongs to be, in the extinction bin of history. Thank you very much to Walt for an excellent talk. We hope you come back very soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll get you next, Jake, but we're gonna get George next. Go ahead, George.
Okay, the neocons have taken control of the foreign and national security policies of both the Democrat and the Republican parties. They are firmly allied to Israel and Israeli interests, and also strongly opposed to both Russia and China. They maintain their control through their powerful presence in the media and the money they are able to raise from primarily Jewish billionaires. Donald Trump, for example, received $100 million from Israeli Marian Abelson.
Yeah.
He's a billionaire. During the just completed election campaign. In return, he will do whatever Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants, including eliminating the Palestinians, despite Trump's recent criticism of Netanyahu. He doesn't like Netanyahu, but since he got the $100 million, he'll criticize. He'll do what Netanyahu wants. Now, as far as my viewpoint on this is, talking to Democrats, they never say anything bad. I very seldom say something bad about Biden. But you see, I say something bad about Trump. I hit it. I tell it like it is. If he's taking $100 million, he's obligated to do what Netanyahu wants. He's talking about taking Gaza over. Who told him to take Gaza over? And all these other things he's doing. I criticize him, but you Democrats don't do that.
Okay, Jake, you got something? All right, Jake, you're on. Unmute. You got 4 minutes, sir. Jake? 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 Jake, you got, unmute, Jake.
5 minutes.
Okay. All right, well, go ahead, sir, and then we'll get you, Ron. Go ahead.
Walt?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, great. I thought you did a very good job tonight. Anyway, what kind of logistics were you in? I was a logistics man.
Oh, okay. I spent 42 years in the logistics industry, which is mainly transportation, but also warehousing, customer service, inventory control. Fascinating career.
Trucking or rail or what?
Well, I was basically purchasing all the transportation for 5 companies. So I managed their logistics programs to get all the products in and all the products out.
Oh, very good. Okay. Here's my my point I wanted to make. Since I'm interested in corruption in America, how it's getting more and more corrupt. What do you recommend? I've been kind of like, like looking into it a bit, and there's the website called it's not called Follow the Money. It's called what is it called? The one it shows how much money all the congressmen get every year.
Oh yeah.
What is it? Open Secrets. Is Open Secrets
right?
Is that about the best corruption finder of Congress and of people in power? Would you say Open Secrets is pretty accurate and is about the best site to go to as far as American corruption?
Well, yeah, it's the only one I'm aware of. I've looked at it a little bit. I think it does a very good job, but I'm not aware of any others. I'm sure there are others, but the information is out there. It's easy to see that we've got 535 congressmen, and almost all of them are bought and sold by the military industrial complex. They're all either bought or totally intimidated by the Israel lobby. And so it's a huge problem.
From Israel. So, okay. Yeah, I don't know if it's, it might be hard to find information about that, but that's your corrupt America right there, is those 500 guys. We probably need more congressmen just to keep an eye on things. I don't trust 500 people in one room. Do you?
I don't trust the ones we've got in power now. They appear to never do the right thing when it comes to foreign affairs. I mean, one good thing we did, and the one good thing Biden did was get out of Afghanistan. I mean, that was shocking to me that he actually got out, but that was so he could pivot to all these other areas that were rampaging around in. And he took so much heat over the way it was handled, which was probably unavoidable, that it made him skittish about doing anything else to work for peace. including going back to the Iran nuclear deal, which he promised to do, and continuing the détente, which he helped shepherd under Obama.
What did he shepherd?
The détente with Cuba. He helped to Cuba. He supported Obama with the détente that reestablished nuclear relations, and he waited till his last couple of days to take Cuba off the list of terrorist nations. He should have done that on day one.
Right. All right. Well,
And then Trump put him back on day one in Trump 2.0.
Okay, Ron Batag, you got your 4 minutes. All right, Ron.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, again, it's not a rebuttal. I think you actually laid out a correct timeline. You laid it out in the battle, I think, fairly clearly between a continuation of this colonial policy, which the U.S. has been pulled into. Obviously, on some layers, it was a plan as they're part of this Tory operation we never gotten rid of. And others of us just fell asleep. We got pulled into speculation as opposed to priding ourselves in science and development. And we've really left a disaster for our kids if we don't immediately make some shifts. So it's not a rebuttal to things that you said, except that we have to keep it at the focus of this fight between the empire faction dominated by these central banks and military production. Those same corporations can be involved in production of modular nuclear reactors. We could drop one next to Puerto Rico and power that thing through any storm. We could build this Oasis plan. We could we could put ourselves back to work as soon as we drop some of our own ideologies. And I think Trump has some indications and ideas in that direction, but he's caught up in his own ideologies, and it's caught as kind of a pragmatic bully in a lot of ways, that he's got the power to force it through. But you can't deal with the Middle East as some kind of real estate project, and we're going to replace. So the consequences involved in this are really crucial. Now, people have suggested various other alternatives. Media, it's an easy access to EIR.news. It's a daily update. It's part of LaRouche's International Strategic Journal that's been coming out since 1978. It's really the journal of record out here in terms of these projects and policies and solutions. So people should look at that. It's EIR.news. My email is Ron Betag, like on the screen, at Gmail. People can get in touch with me. But immediately on Monday, Tulsi Gabbard, Patel, these guys are up for nominations, and they're not perfect people, but it does open doors to investigate this deeper bunch that's part of the deep state. And so we've got to continue to crack that. It's like the, release now of the various documents on Kennedy and King.
Yeah.
These things open up doors, not who we're going to find, who's the shooting gun, but break this control of the narrative, because the networks and policies who ran that are still in place. 9/11, we have a day when normal policy is, if a plane goes off schedule, they try to reach them, they get no answer. They send up 2 F-16s that are faster than the plane, and they track them down. What's wrong? Here you have 4 of them going off track and no plane went up. So this was not just a terrorist operation from outside. There's a bigger component here, and I think somebody alluded to, as LaRouche was laying out in January of 2021, that in this kind of crisis, you need a crisis management program. So you can go back and check in January 2021, LaRouche in Seattle is laying out this kind of project, and that we have to measure and look for these kinds of things setting up. Now, he did not say it'll be Washington, D.C. and the towers in New York on this particular day, but the policy, like a Reichstag fire in Germany, was this kind of creation of a lockdown then through Patriotic Act and whatever. So there's coups in the United States. From the Kennedy assassination and others, we didn't do anything about it. We didn't force an investigation. Same thing with this. So we're at a point where a lot of that can be opened up. So people should hold their noses, whatever, but let's get these appointments through. You can tell by the reaction, and I put a thing in the chat, but I don't think it went through, on this, the Liars Bureau. You can go to the LaRouche organization site to get a copy of it. We can actually open this up. The American people individually have a role to play in this, in creating a movement as opposed to waiting for parties and other structures. We're out of all that kind of time. We've got to move now. So we got a lot of allies to freeze this mountain of paper, put this entire derivative bubble in a Chapter 11. It doesn't produce anything anyway, and earmark the credit like Lincoln and Roosevelt did immediately into production. Let's have Trump take that up as a big project. Let him put his name on it. I don't care, but let's force that issue publicly. Let's just get a debate on it. So on the Oasis plan, but people should look up EIR.news. Again, I appreciate your comments. I think you were spot on, but we got to hold it on this bigger fight of the drivers on the economy that are forcing this perpetual war. That's one of their tools. Perpetual war. War is their policy. It's not that somebody's doing exactly what they want to do. And that's got us to a nuclear situation that you can't make a mistake. There is a point, it's being too late, as Kennedy, not Kennedy, but King used to say. So anyway, I'll leave it there, but thank you for your presentation.
All right,
Get in touch with me, I'd appreciate that.
Jake, you're up. You want to rebut? Your hands up. Jake, are you there? Going once, going twice. Anybody else? Anybody else want to rebut? All right. Francois, we'll get you next.
You know what? I think I think this Rubio might be a pretty good we had Biden had some bad people around him, I can tell looking back. He had
all right, let's let Mike finish.
Is Bernie gonna be Secretary of Labor?
Biden didn't let him, even though he requested.
Yeah, Biden had some bad people around. The Secretary of State Blinkley or whatever his name is.
Lincoln.
Horrible. And then the guy that was the border czar, what was his name? Yes, he was horrible. I mean, when I look at that chart that I had up here a couple months ago, I mean, he didn't do anything about it. And he was really bad. Biden had some bad people around him. So I hope Rubio turns out to be a good Secretary of State, because maybe that solves wars somehow. And he speaks Spanish, so that's good. But he seems pretty smart. I know he's a righty, but so I'm not always anti-righty. I mean, sometimes these guys are pretty good. And what's your feeling about that? I just he seems like he was the best person to come out of the Trump.
I'm not too happy with Rubio. He's hardline on China, very hardline on China. He's one of the ones that says China is our biggest enemy. That's the one we've got to worry about the most. He went to Latin America.
Militarily.
He was on board for possibly pulling back the Panama Canal from Panama. I think he even said, we built it, we deserve it. When in fact, we just went in there and built it. We peeled off Panama. We created a revolution where Panama was split off from Colombia so that we could force Panama to let us build it. So he's not against enabling the genocide in Gaza, and he's, at this point, as far as I know, he's not turned against negotiating an end. He's not supported an end to the Ukraine war. So I don't see anything positive there. He's always been a very bellicose senator when it comes to U.S. foreign policy and perpetual wars.
Oh, so you have a bad review of him. Okay.
Okay, we got two more people up. Francois, go ahead.
I don't want to say very much. That was a great presentation, Walt. You do a great job. And if anybody doesn't get Walt's regular emails on topical topics, you should get hold of his email address and go on the mailing list. He does a great job. I just want to make a point that Tulsi Gabbard, when she was grilled by Mark Kelly, Tulsi Gabbard spilled the beans on the truth about what the US had been doing in Syria. In other words, funding and arming terrorist Islamist groups. Mark Kelly's response to her was that, and his objection to Tulsi Gabbard was that she was saying what the supposed what Syrian government was saying and the Russian government was saying. In other words, he wasn't objecting to her, he wasn't grateful that she was actually telling the truth. It was just happened to reflect what the Syrian government was saying. And that's his objection. And I noticed in the chat here, I wrote something about what was happening in Ukraine. And the response I got was, Francis, where do you get your Russian talking points from? Now, the Democratic Party used this, and the media used this. If you tell the truth, you're accused of being a Putinist, watching RT News, and if you support the Palestinians, you're accused of supporting Hamas. And that's very dangerous talk. And it's extremely disappointing that people in this supposedly free speech group, which was how it was advertised, come up with such nonsense accusations. So that's one point I wasn't going to make, but I did make. But the second point is that empires in decline rarely go quietly in the night. The British Empire still hasn't gone quietly in the night. They react in dangerous, unpredictable ways. The UK is trying to punch way above its weight. They have an army that wouldn't even fill Manchester United football stadium, yet they're the most bellicose countries in Europe in terms of being opposed to Russia. And of course, as you know, Boris Johnson went over to Ukraine in March, April 2022 and put a kibosh on the peace negotiations. Ukraine and Russia had almost come to an agreement, and Boris Johnson went over there and told Zelensky not to sign the agreement. The West and NATO will support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
And Lloyd Austin went also.
Yeah. And certainly it wasn't just Boris Johnson's idea. It was certainly at the behest or in total agreement with the Biden administration. Joe Biden deserves to be tried for war crimes. He is responsible, I think I said this at the last meeting, for genocide in Gaza and genocide in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died totally unnecessarily. This was a war that should not have taken place. Trump was absolutely right on that point. I don't trust Trump at all that he would finish this war. I think Putin, I think Walter said it exactly right. Putin is going to get those 4 oblasts. He may even get more than that, may get 5 or 6 actually. And Ukraine will never be in NATO. And the West, the sooner the West realizes that and comes to terms with it, the better. The economy of Europe is going, the UK is in a tremendous, really bad economic situation. Germany is in a bad economic situation. They don't have the funds to go to 5% of their GDP to supply weapons. Their armies are not well equipped to fight Russia. One of the complaints of the Ukrainian troops is that, as you know, thousands of them go to Poland, France, and the UK for training. They're trained by the British Army, the French Army, the Polish Army. None of these armies, no NATO army, has any experience in fighting in a war situation where there are drones overhead. They have no experience whatsoever. So their training is completely 20th century training, and they throw these young people into a meat grinder. And I think Lindsey Graham summed it up best. He said, it's great investment for the US. No US soldiers' feet on the ground. There's no US deaths, which I don't believe. I think there are US deaths. And it's great for US industry. It supplies lots of high-paying jobs. And of course, as Trump has recently discovered, I think, there are minerals in Ukraine, which they're particularly minerals in the east of Ukraine, more so than in the West. And the US does not want to give Russia those minerals. And it also wants to harm Russia's access to the Arctic. That's another reason why they're a strategic war against Russia. And it's another reason why, of course, Trump is after Greenland. That's it.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Jake, one last chance. You opened your hand up. I'm giving you a chance now to speak. Otherwise, I'm going to let Charlie go. Can you hear me, Jake? Unmute. Jake, unmute. Jake?
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Now, Jake.
Okay. Okay. Can you? Okay. First of all, Putin supposedly went into Ukraine to keep them from joining NATO. I think that's just an excuse. Putin's got it backwards. NATO will be expanded because of Putin's actions. He has no business being there. I see that as Putin's Ukraine. I mean, Putin's Vietnam. If Boris Yeltsin had been there, he never would have gone in there. There was a treaty negotiated, I believe, in 1993 between Russia and Ukraine. It's called the Budapest Agreement, saying that, with Bill Clinton co-signing it, saying that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons arsenal to Russia. At that time, about 40% of the world's nuclear weapons were located in Ukraine. Yanushchenko was in power at that time. He gave up the nuclear weapons in Ukraine to Russia. In exchange, U.S. and Great Britain were agreed to defend Ukraine in the event of a Russian invasion. That was the arrangement. So, by Putin going into Ukraine, he violated that agreement. So I don't know how it'll end up. Zelensky says that he's willing to compromise on territory in order to make peace with Russia. Putin has not responded on that one. So I have no sympathy at all for Putin. In terms of Gaza, I don't know what's going to happen there. It takes two to tango. They're both at each other's throats. The Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas is willing to accept Israel's right to exist. We haven't heard anything to the sort from Hamas. I believe in a two-state solution, but in order to do that, both sides have to accept the other. So that's all I'm going to say on that.
Okay, Charlie, you got anything?
Oh, one other thing I want to say is that this assertion that the U.S. is always wrong and everybody else is right, I don't buy that. It's much more. The situation is much more complicated than that. You have to look at nuances.
Okay, Charlie, did you want to say anything else? Charlie, do you want to say anything?
Yes.
Go ahead.
All right. First of all, I've got four things to say rather tersely. Number one, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Walt, for a very nice presentation and an outline of your view of the situation and your efforts towards bringing world peace. And I invite you again to bring us an update on what progress, if any, is being made to bring about peace in the world and end the perpetual war. Number two, a number of years ago, we collected 10 signatures, actually more, but a minimum of 10, and we established a chapter of the War Resisters League from people who attended the college complexes from among the regulars. It's been in operation. We maintain a website, show up at rallies and things of that nature. Here, I put it in chat, the link. It's very simple, WRL Chicago. Visit the site and become a member of the War Resisters League. Last time I looked, it doesn't cost anything. Number three, the Republicans are in control of Congress, and I can assure you, after nearly 35 or 40 years of working the Hill as a lobbyist for various issues, is that the Republicans are solidly looking towards increasing the military budget. The hearings are beginning this year. Every spring, the committees have their budget hearings. If you're really interested in this topic, try to log into it or follow the committee efforts in that regard. Now, the last thing I was going to say about that, the Republicans are en masse are solidly pro-military. And I heard the disparaging things about Democrats. You have to pick up allies. And if you want your point of view on the Hill. Now, the Democrats are not maniacal like the Republicans. That's the Republican Party gets kickbacks. They do military, they get contracts, award contracts to the, and then there's a kickback of money to the Republican Party. That's how it maintains itself. This is well-known fact. The Democrats are not tied in as solidly. They will go along with the budget because they use it as a trade-off. They want to collect votes for a particular other measure. So they say it's a trade-off. And they say, well, I'll vote for your budget if you vote for this law that I'm advancing. That's what happens. So don't start disparaging the Democrats. You have to work on them and convince them to not make this trade deal that they do every budget session of Congress. And last of all, regarding 9/11, in 25 years, not one person has been identified as a federal government employee who was involved in any fashion in the planning and execution of the events of 9/11. Not one person has given a deathbed confession or given an affidavit explaining what happens. That very good research, guys. Anyhow, thank you, Walt. Please come again. Thank you.
Charlie, was the Iraq War a bipartisan war or just a Republican war? Just thought I'd ask.
Program.
All right, Andy Anderson.
Okay, couple of quick comments. I gave a talk here 6 years ago. Well, it was 2018 maybe. Trump has just passed his 15,000 whopper. We had the 2018 edition of Censored News. We were talking about the top 10 censored overnight if they were covered rather than blacked out. Halfway through my talk, the lady held up her hand and said, Andy, if what you're telling us is true in this book, that would mean some of our politicians have been lying to us. Oh, well, hello. What planet have you been living on? Knowledge spreads unevenly through a population. At one point in history, a whole lot of people believed the earth was flat. Today, there's 618 people in the Flat Earth Society. They meet at a conference in Denver every couple of years. But the rest of us have gone with the ball earth theory. This knowledge is spreading around the world. It's spread really fast outside the United States on the false flag of 9/11. Inside the United States, the fairy tale is promoted that 19 crazed Muslims attacked us with 4 airliners, and that was 2 airliners hitting the towers resulted in the destruction of 7 buildings. 7 buildings were destroyed in the event known as 9/11. The media filmed the first 2 and told us we were attacked by Al Qaeda. This is if Stephanie is still listening.
She's not on.
What?
She's off now.
Since Stephanie left. People left. Yeah, I should have got up here earlier. At any rate, David Ray Griffin wrote 12 books on the various pieces of the forensic evidence that's been published that in direct contradiction to the official fairy tale that Charlie keeps going. And I would like to mention one thing. Charlie keeps saying we can't prosecute the crime of 9/11, or we can't even call it a crime until the perpetrator comes forward and confessed. I've interviewed at 7-Eleven, wherever I see him. I've asked several dozen police officers over the last 5 years, do you have to wait for somebody to come in and confess to the crime before you start to investigate? They all laugh in my face. They say, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard of. There's all kinds of crimes. Crimes go unsolved until the police solve them. The overwhelming majority of murders and everything else, the overwhelming majority, probably 99%, don't have somebody come in and say, hey, I did it, put the cuffs on me. They try to hide. Well, the people that did 9/11, they're not going to come forward and say, we murdered 3,000 Americans. That's just not right. All you need to know about 9/11 is that the Twin Towers were converted to dust in the air with explosives going from the top down. Twin Towers, each tower went sideways in the wind as a cloud of dust. It's documented in the films, but that knowledge hits some people's brains and just hits a brick wall. It's called intentional ignorance, learned ignorance where they cannot face reality. Jack Nicholson had the most famous comment on that in A Few Good Men. Colonel Jessup, he says, you can't handle the truth. Remember that? Well, this is where we are on 9/11. A lot of people simply can't handle the truth that 3,000 Americans were murdered by Americans, and the myth was promoted by American billionaires who own and operate our media. Last thing, I would tell everybody, watch the movie War Games. In the summer of '83, the two computers, basically War Games was mythology or a movie, fiction, but in the summer of '87, that was very real. We had red alerts, false alarms, all kinds of stuff until both sides shut their computer hardware down. And incidentally, we don't have to worry about anybody flying missiles through the air. The 12,000-pound bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima has been condensed down to something the size of a football, weighs 20 pounds. You can carry it around in a purse or a knapsack or a backpack. In 1985, somebody published an article called The 12 Bomb War. 12 properly outfitted motorcycles with knapsacks with Hiroshima blast bombs attached, parked 6 near nuclear power plants, 6 near nuclear cities, in major cities, 6 in cities, 6 in nuclear power plants, and America would cease to be a place for human habitation. As they paraphrase the old commercial back then, Kawasaki lets the good times roll. 12 motorcycles with undetectable knapsacks, and we're history. And here they're talking about 5,000 missiles and everything else. All that shit is obsolete completely. And this is where we are. So there's a website called Want to Know Info. I would encourage everybody to log on to that, because that's the most inspirational site with all kinds of different people of different disciplines working for world peace, a cleaner environment, solving the problems, the wartime problems we have. And my time's up. So if anybody's got any questions, feel free to call me.
Yeah, I'd like to know the name of one person who committed 9/11.
Albert.
Just one.
9/11 was a collective effort, Charlie. If you want to know the names of some people that were involved, log on to Architects and Engineers for 9/11.
I want you to give me the name of someone who should be charged with the crime.
Okay.
The investigation is still going on, Charlie.
Jake, unmute, you're on. Jake, you got your hand up.
It just
Hello, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay, just one thing I forgot before. Yeah, the U.S., the Cold War was supposedly over 30 years ago, and yet we have much larger nuclear weapons arsenal than we did then. Congress has committed $1.2 trillion for this over 20 years' time to complete this nuclear weapons modernization program, which means that there will be nuclear warheads placed on supersonic missiles that fly faster than the speed of sound. And apparently, again, to the tune of $1.2 trillion over 20 years' time. Apparently, we're doing it in response to something that Putin is doing, namely Putin has actually done this faster than before we did, so we're responding to him. What we should do is go into an international treaty banning this technology altogether. So that's all I have to say there.
Okay, Walt, you get the final say. You got about 8 to 10 minutes. Go ahead and make your final arguments. You get the last word.
Okay. Thank you, Charles and Tim. This was a fascinating evening for me. I've given this presentation a number of times, but by a wide margin, I got the best questions and comments ever from any of the groups that I've spoken before. I'm absolutely delighted and thrilled that the College of Complexes is still in existence. It's a wonderful organization. That there should be one in every city in the country, because you really have a great format for allowing speakers to present their views and have a very reasonable, rational discussion afterwards. I just cannot thank you enough. It's been my pleasure. In the chat, I put my email. If you'd like, I do a post every day, mostly on foreign affairs, and my email is my last name, Zlotow@hotmail.com. That's ZLOTOW. So if you email me to do so, I'll put you on my daily distribution. I also have a Substack account, and I also am heading up the West Suburban Peace Coalition in Glen Ellen, Illinois. We have monthly programs like this. We call them educational forums on Zoom. We run a peace essay contest, mainly geared toward high school kids and college kids, giving out prizes for the best essay on how to promote peace in the United States and beyond. And of course, we lobby our congressman and our president to use diplomacy instead of perpetual war to settle international disputes. So again, thank you very much for having me. That's all I'm going to say. And on that note, again, it's been my pleasure. And I hope that you all continue to work in whatever way you can for a more peaceful nation and world. Thank you.
Hey, Walt, could you repeat your address there in Illinois?
My email address is...
I've got that. You could repeat it again, but your office there where you run the...
Oh,
program.
yes. It's in my home at 340 Greenfield. That's one word, Greenfield Avenue. Glen Ellen, that's two words, capital Glen, capital ELLYN, Illinois, 60137.
Where do you hold these, or?
We hold we typically near the end of the month. The one I'm trying to set up for this month is prospects for foreign policy under Trump. Should be very interesting. And our speaker is a person who just wrote a big article about that in antiwar.com, Jose Nino. So I'll be happy to put you on our mailing list.
Okay.
All right, I couldn't resist that little bit of musical interlude there, so. Anyway, Walter, thank you for coming tonight. That College of Complexes is now adjourned. Charlie, do you want to take the conversation offline? I can send you the admin controls.
Oh, I think we'll call it a night. Thank you, Tim.
All right. With that, the College of Complexes is adjourned.
So long, everybody.
Nice meeting you.
You're the smartest. That guy should speak every Saturday.
Hello?
I have no idea
Hi.
what that was supposed to be.
Hi. Hi, Tim?
Yes.
We're closing, Jay.